They laughed in her face. They called her trash. They told their own son that if he married the pregnant waitress, he would lose every single penny of his inheritance. Victoria Whitmore, the matriarch of New York's most elite family, literally threw a prenup at the poor girl's chest and pointed to the door. Charlie chose love. He walked out, leaving billions behind to live in a studio apartment with his wife Morgan. But the Whitmores made a fatal mistake. They didn't check Morgan's birth certificate. They didn't know that the girl they were destroying wasn't a nobody. She was hiding a last name that could buy and sell the entire Whitmore empire before breakfast. And when the truth finally hit the headlines, it wasn't just revenge. It was a massacre. The invitation had arrived on heavy cream cardstock, embossed with gold leaf. It wasn't just a dinner invitation. In the high-stakes world of the Upper East Side elite, it was a summons. Charlie Whitmore adjusted his tie in the reflection of the elevator doors. He was sweating despite the crisp air conditioning of the penthouse lobby. Beside him stood Morgan. She looked radiant in a simple navy dress she'd bought off the rack at Macy's for $80. She was rubbing her thumb nervously against the strap of her purse. She was 3 months pregnant, though she was barely showing. "They're going to hate me," Morgan whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Charlie took her hand, squeezing it tight. "They don't have to like you, Morgan. They just have to respect that you're my wife. And once they know about the baby, my mother loves the idea of a legacy more than anything. It'll be okay." Charlie was lying to himself. He knew exactly who his parents were. Rowan and Victoria Whitmore weren't just rich. They were old money institutionals. They owned half the commercial real estate in Manhattan and had a controlling interest in Whitmore Global, a shipping conglomerate worth billions. To them, bloodlines were like balance sheets. They had to be kept clean. The elevator doors slid open directly into the foyer of the penthouse. The air smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax. A butler took their coats without a word. Victoria Whitmore was waiting in the drawing room holding a glass of Chardonnay as if it were a weapon. She didn't hug her son. She didn't smile. Her eyes immediately darted to Morgan, scanning her from her sensible heels to her inexpensive earrings. It was a look of clinical dissection. "So," Victoria said, her voice like cracking ice, "this is the situation." "This is Morgan," Charlie said, his voice firm. "My wife." Wife. Rowan Whitmore entered the room, a cigar in hand. He was a large man who took up space aggressively. "A courthouse signature doesn't make a wife in this family, Charlie. It makes a liability." The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They sat at a mahogany table long enough to land a plane on. The silence was punctuated only by the clinking of silver against china. "So Morgan," Victoria said, picking at her squab. "Charlie tells us you work in hospitality." "I'm a barista at a cafe near the university," Morgan said politely. "I'm also finishing my degree in art history." Rowan snorted, a loud, wet sound of derision. "Art history. Fantastic. That prepares you for what exactly? Dusting museums?" "Dad, stop," Charlie warned. "I'm just being practical, son," Rowan said, leaning forward. "You are the heir to a Fortune 500 company. We had an arrangement with the Kensington family. Their daughter Beatrice is currently waiting for a call you never made. Instead, you bring us a girl who serves coffee." "I love her," Charlie said. "And she's pregnant. You're going to be grandparents." The room went dead silent. The grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder. Victoria placed her fork down with a deliberate clink. She looked at Morgan, not with joy, but with pure disgust. "You trapped him." "Excuse me," Morgan gasped. "The oldest trick in the book," Victoria hissed, standing up. She walked over to a sideboard and pulled out a manila envelope. She tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Morgan's plate. "That is a post-nuptial agreement," Victoria stated, "and a check for $50,000. It's a generous severance package. You will sign the papers, you will terminate the pregnancy, and you will disappear. You can use the money to finish your little art degree." Morgan stared at the check. Her face went pale, then red. She stood up, her hands shaking. "I'm not a prostitute. I'm your son's wife." "You are a gold digger," Rowan roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Look at you, you have nothing. You come from nothing. You think you can waltz into the Whitmore dynasty with a bastard in your belly and take a seat at the table." Charlie stood up, knocking his chair over. "That's enough. We're leaving." "If you walk out that door," Rowan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, "you leave everything. The trust fund, the apartment, the cards, the car. You will be cut off, Charlie. Completely. You'll be nothing but a common laborer." Charlie looked at his father, then at his mother, who was looking at him with cold indifference. Then he looked at Morgan, who was holding back tears, humiliated and shaking. "Keep the money," Charlie said. He took Morgan's hand. "I'd rather starve than turn into you." They walked out. As the elevator doors closed, they heard Victoria's laugh. It was a sharp, barking sound. "He'll be back in a week," she shouted. "When the hungry little waitress realizes he's broke, she'll leave him." Victoria Whitmore's prediction was wrong. Morgan didn't leave, but the starving part wasn't far off. The reality of being disowned hit Charlie like a freight train. He had grown up in a world where problems were solved with a phone call. Now his phone was disconnected. His credit cards were declined at the gas station an hour after the dinner. They had to sell Charlie's vintage Rolex just to put a deposit down on a fourth-floor walk-up in Queens. The apartment was a far cry from the penthouse. The radiator clanked all night, the windows leaked drafty air, and the view was a brick wall. Charlie, a man with a business degree from Wharton, found himself unhireable. It wasn't just bad luck. It was sabotage. Every time he interviewed for a junior analyst position at a firm, things would go well until the background check. Rowan Whitmore had a long reach. He had blacklisted his own son. No one in the city wanted to hire the boy who had spat in the face of the Whitmore empire. Charlie ended up taking a job at a construction site in New Jersey. He came home every night covered in drywall dust, his hands blistered and raw. Morgan tried to work as long as she could, but the pregnancy was difficult. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, preeclampsia, the doctors warned. She was put on bed rest at 6 months. The winter of 2014 was brutal. "We have to pay the heating bill, Charlie," Morgan said one evening, wrapped in 3 blankets on their lumpy sofa. She looked gaunt, her eyes dark circles in a pale face. "It's 20 degrees outside." "I know," Charlie said, looking at the stack of red envelopes on the table. "I picked up a double shift this weekend. I'll make it work." He kissed her forehead, but he was terrified. They had $40 in their checking account. Then the emergency happened. Charlie was at the job site when he got the call. Morgan had collapsed. She was at Mount Sinai, Queens. Charlie ran. He didn't wait for the bus. He ran 6 blocks to the train station, panic seizing his chest. When he arrived, the doctor looked grave. "It's severe preeclampsia. Her kidneys are struggling. We need to stabilize her, but the stress..." "Mr. Whitmore, does she have insurance?" "She didn't." Charlie's coverage had been terminated by his father. Morgan's part-time job didn't offer benefits. "Do whatever you have to do," Charlie pleaded. "Save her. Save the baby." Charlie sat in the waiting room, his head in his hands. He knew he had no choice. He walked to the payphone. His cell service had been cut off 2 days ago, and dialed the number he swore he never would. "Whitmore Residence," the butler answered. "Let me speak to my mother," Charlie said, his voice cracking. A moment later, Victoria's voice came on the line. "Well, I assume you're ready to apologize." "Mom, please," Charlie sobbed. "Morgan is in the hospital. It's bad. The baby is in trouble. We have no insurance. They need to run tests. I just need $5,000. I'll pay you back. I'll sign whatever you want. Just help us." There was a silence on the other end. A long, cruel silence. "You made your bed, Charlie," Victoria said. "If she loses the baby, perhaps it's for the best. It gives you a clean slate to come home." Click. She hung up. Charlie stared at the phone receiver, the dial tone buzzing like a hornet in his ear. A rage he had never known began to boil in his gut. They wanted his child to die. They wanted his wife to suffer. He walked back to Morgan's room. She was awake, hooked up to monitors. She looked so small. "Did you call them?" she asked weakly. Charlie nodded, tears streaming down his face mixed with construction dust. "They said no." Morgan didn't cry. A strange calmness settled over her face. She reached out and took Charlie's rough, calloused hand. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. No more begging. Morgan." "I don't know what to do," Charlie admitted. "I failed you." "No, you didn't. You loved me." She took a deep breath, wincing in pain. "Charlie, hand me my purse, the old leather one. Morgan, you need to rest. Hand me the purse, Charlie." Her voice had a steeliness he had never heard before. He handed it to her. She dug through the lining past the crumpled receipts and gum wrappers and pulled out a small, antiquated flip phone. It wasn't her regular smartphone. It was a burner phone, or so Charlie thought. She flipped it open. There was only one number saved in the contacts. She pressed dial. Charlie watched, confused. "Who are you calling?" "We don't have anyone." Morgan put the phone to her ear. Her eyes were closed, but tears leaked out of the corners. "Hello?" she said into the phone. Her voice broke. "Grandfather, it's Serafina. I know I broke the promise. But I need you. They're trying to kill my baby." Charlie froze. Serafina Morgan listened for a moment, then nodded. "Mount Sinai, Queens." "Yes. Thank you." She closed the phone and looked at Charlie. "Pack your things, Charlie. We're being moved." Moved where who was that? That, Morgan said, was the only man your father is afraid of. Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere in the hospital changed. It started with a man in a suit. He wasn't a doctor. He walked into the cramped room wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Charlie's annual salary at the construction site. He carried a briefcase and wore an earpiece. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the man asked. He hesitated on the last name. "Yes," Morgan said. She seemed to sit straighter in the hospital bed. "My name is Arthur Vance. I am head of security for the estate. A helicopter is landing on the roof in 5 minutes. We have a medical team from Zurich General on board. We are transferring you to the private wing at New York Presbyterian. The entire floor has been secured." Charlie stood up, stepping between the man and Morgan. "Who are you?" "What is going on?" The man looked at Charlie. He didn't look down on him unlike the Whitmores. He looked at Charlie with a strange mix of curiosity and respect. "You must be the husband. Mr. Blackwood has been monitoring you." "Blackwood?" Charlie frowned. "I don't know any Blackwood." Morgan squeezed Charlie's hand. "Charlie, please. Just trust me. I'll explain everything. Just come with me." The transfer was a blur. They were whisked up to the roof, loaded into a Sikorsky helicopter that looked more like a flying living room than an aircraft, and flown across the city. When they arrived at the new hospital, it wasn't a room. It was a suite. Marble floors, a view of Central Park, and the 3 specialists waiting. They stabilized Morgan immediately. The bill, which Charlie knew must be astronomical, was never even mentioned. 2 days later, Morgan was stable. The danger had passed. Charlie sat by the bed, looking at his wife. She looked healthier, her color returning. "Blackwood," Charlie said softly. "Morgan, the only Blackwood I know of is Silas Blackwood, the steel tycoon, the guy who owns the mines in Africa and half the shipping routes in the Pacific. He's a myth. He hasn't been seen in public since 1998. Morgan looked down at her hands. "He's not a myth. He's my grandfather." Charlie stared at her. "You told me your parents died in a car crash in Ohio. You said you grew up in foster care." "My parents did die in a crash," Morgan said quietly. "My mother was Silas Blackwood's only daughter. She ran away when she was 19, because she hated the life. She hated the security guards, the kidnappings, scares, the fake friends. She wanted to be normal. She changed her name to Miller. She met my dad, a mechanic. They were happy. Poor but happy." She looked up at Charlie, her eyes pleading for understanding. "When they died, my grandfather found me. I was 6. He wanted to take me back to the estate in Geneva, to raise me as the heir. I lived there for 10 years. It was a golden call." Charlie: "I had everything, but I had nothing. At 16, I ran away just like my mom. I wanted to see if I could make it on my own. I wanted to know if someone could love me, not for the Blackwood Trust." She reached out and touched Charlie's face. "And I found him. You gave up billions for a waitress, Charlie. You proved it. You passed a test I didn't even know I was giving." Charlie was reeling. His wife wasn't just rich. The Whitmores were millionaires, perhaps low-level billionaires. Silas Blackwood was a sovereign power. He was the kind of money that controlled governments. "Does he know about us?" Charlie asked. "He knows everything," Morgan said. "He's been watching, and he is very, very angry at how your parents treated us." Just then the door to the suite opened. An old man entered. He was in a wheelchair, pushing himself with surprising strength. He had a shock of white hair and eyes that looked like polished flint. He wore a cardigan that looked centuries old. Silas Blackwood. He wheeled himself to the side of the bed. He looked at Morgan, and his hard face softened. "You look like your mother, Serafina." "Hi, grandfather," Morgan whispered. Silas turned his gaze to Charlie. It was a terrifying inspection. Charlie felt like he was being X-rayed. "You..." Silas grunted. "You're the boy who told Rowan Whitmore to go to hell." "Yes, sir," Charlie said, standing tall. Silas stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly a grin spread across his face. "Good. I never liked Rowan. Cheap suits, cheaper morals." Silas tapped the arm of his wheelchair. "I have a proposition. My granddaughter is going to have this baby in peace, but the world needs to know who she is, and the Whitmores need to be taught a lesson in humility. Are you in?" Charlie thought about his mother laughing as they walked out of the penthouse. He thought about the dial tone when he begged for his wife's life. "I'm in," Charlie said. Silas nodded to the lawyer Arthur Vance. "Arthur, initiate Operation Glass House, and get me the file on Whitmore Global's debt restructuring." Arthur smiled a shark-like grin. "Already done, sir. Their loans are up for renewal next week. The bank is wavering." "Buy the bank," Silas said casually. "And get us tickets to the Met Gala. I hear the Whitmores are chairing it this year." 3 months later. The Met Gala is the pinnacle of New York society. For Victoria Whitmore, it was her coronation. She was the chairwoman of the event. She had spent months curating the guest list, ensuring that only the absolute cream of the crop attended. She stood at the top of the famous stairs wearing a custom Dior gown flanked by Rowan. They looked like royalty. "This is a triumph, Victoria," Rowan murmured, waving to the press. "The stock is up 2 points. Everyone is here." "Not everyone," Victoria said, scanning the crowd. "I don't see the senator." But generally she was pleased. She had successfully erased Charlie from the narrative. When people asked, she simply said he was taking a sabbatical in Europe. Suddenly a hush fell over the red carpet. It started at the street level and rippled up the stairs like a wave. The flashing cameras, usually a constant stroboscopic storm, stopped for a split second, then erupted with 10 times the intensity. A limousine had pulled up. Not a standard limo, but a vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom 6 jet black, with the crest of the Blackwood family on the door. "Who is that?" Rowan squinted. "That crest, isn't that—" The door opened. Silas Blackwood did not emerge. Instead, a young man stepped out. It was Charlie, but not the Charlie in dusty work boots. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, tailored on Savile Row. He looked stronger, broader, more confident. He reached a hand back into the car. Morgan emerged. Gasps were audible from the crowd. Morgan was heavily pregnant, glowing, wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet that shimmered like the night sky. Around her neck was the Star of the East, a diamond necklace that hadn't been seen since an auction in 1982, where it sold for $40 million. They walked up the stairs. The press was screaming. "Charlie, Charlie, is that your wife? Who is she wearing?" Victoria Whitmore felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped Rowan's arm. "What are they doing here? Security? Get them out." She marched down a few steps to intercept them, blocking their path before they could reach the entrance doors. "You have some nerve!" Victoria hissed, her voice low, so the cameras wouldn't catch the venom. "Crashing my event in rented clothes. You are an embarrassment. Turn around and leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." Charlie looked at his mother. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked pitying. "We aren't crashing, Mother," Charlie said calmly. "We were invited." "By whom?" Rowan sneered. "I own this board." "Actually," a deep voice boomed from behind them. Arthur Vance, the lawyer, stepped up. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, you are chairing the event, yes, but the event is sponsored by the Blackwood Foundation." "Blackwood," Victoria faltered. "Silas Blackwood is a recluse. He's dead for all I know." "He is very much alive," Arthur said, and he wished for his granddaughter to attend her first public function. "Granddaughter?" Victoria looked around, confused. "What are you talking about?" Charlie smiled. He took Morgan's hand and raised it. "Mom, Dad, you remember Morgan? You called her a nobody. I'd like to reintroduce you." Charlie looked directly into the camera lenses that were zooming in. This is Morgan Seraphina Blackwood, sole heiress to the Blackwood industrial empire, and the mother of your future grandson." The silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. Victoria looked at Morgan. She looked at the necklace, which was worth more than the Whitmore penthouse. She looked at the steel in Morgan's eyes. "Blackwood," Rowan choked out. The steel supplier. Our biggest creditor." "The very same," Morgan said. Her voice was no longer the timid whisper of the girl in the coffee shop. It was the voice of a woman who owned the ground she stood on. "And as of this morning, my grandfather's company has acquired the bank that holds the debt for Whitmore Global." Morgan leaned in close to Victoria, so their noses almost touched. The morning after the Met Gala, the world had changed for the Whitmore family. It wasn't just the headlines, though those were brutal. The New York Post ran a front-page photo of Victoria's shocked face next to a radiant Morgan with the headline, "Whitmore Whiplash, the billionaire barista." Twitter was trending with hashtag Team Morgan and hashtag Wicked Witch of Wall Street. But for Rowan and Victoria, the real damage wasn't on social media, it was on the balance sheet. At 8 a.m. sharp, Rowan Whitmore arrived at the headquarters of Whitmore Global in Midtown Manhattan. Usually the lobby guards would salute him. Today they looked at their shoes. The receptionist stopped typing as he walked by. The air in the building was thick with the scent of blood in the water. Rowan stormed into his office, slamming the door. "Get me legal," he barked at his assistant. "And get my son on the phone. Now." "I'm afraid that won't be necessary, Rowan." Rowan spun around. Sitting in his leather executive chair, the chair Rowan had sat in for 30 years, was Charlie. Charlie looked entirely different from the desperate young man who had begged for help months ago. He was clean-shaven, wearing a navy suit, and reading a file on Rowan's desk. Standing by the window looking out at the skyline was Morgan. She wore a cream-colored maternity dress and a blazer. She didn't look like a barista anymore. She looked like the owner. "Get out of my chair," Rowan snarled, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Security. Security works for the board, Dad," Charlie said calmly, not moving. "And as of 7:30 this morning, the board has been restructured." "Restructured? You can't restructure without my vote. I own 51% of the voting shares." "Actually," Morgan said, turning from the window, "you owned 51% of the shares leveraged against the company's debt. You used your own stock as collateral for the expansion loans in 2018. A risky move, Rowan." Rowan froze. "Those loans aren't due until 2028. "Technically, yes," Morgan said, walking over to the desk and placing a heavy document on top of it. "Unless the lender determines that the reputation of the borrower has become materially adverse to the security of the loan. It's a standard clause. Clause 14b. She tapped the newspaper on the desk with the Wicked Witch headline. "Public humiliation," Morgan said. "Scandal. The CEO disowning his own heir. It makes the market nervous. The lender has the right to call the loan immediately to protect their asset." "And who is the lender?" Rowan whispered, though he already knew the answer. "Blackwood Capital," Morgan said softly. "My grandfather bought the debt, Rowan, and he transferred it to a trust, in my name." Rowan collapsed onto the visitor's sofa. The fight drained out of him. He knew the numbers. If the loan was called now, he would have to liquidate his personal holdings to cover it. He would lose the houses, the cars, the art collection. "What do you want?" Rowan asked, his voice shaking. "You want an apology?" "Fine. I'm sorry. We were harsh. We were protecting the family interests." The door opened, and Victoria burst in. She looked disheveled, her usual perfect blowout flat. "Rowan, my credit cards." The black card was declined at Bergdorf's. They cut it up in front of me. She saw Charlie and stopped. Her eyes narrowed. "You, fix this. Tell your wife to call off her dogs." Charlie stood up slowly. He walked around the desk and stood in front of his parents. "You know," Charlie said, his voice conversational, "I thought about this moment a lot when I was scraping drywall mud off my hands in a freezing apartment in Queens. I thought I would want to scream at you, but I just feel tired." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, stained envelope. It was the same manila envelope Victoria had thrown at Morgan at the dinner months ago. "You gave Morgan a choice," Charlie said. $50,000 to leave, or nothing." He tossed the envelope onto the coffee table in front of them. "We're giving you a choice, too." Morgan stepped forward. "Option A, I call the loan. Whitmore Global goes into immediate receivership. You are stripped of your assets to pay the debt. You file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. You lose the penthouse. You lose the Hamptons estate. You end up with nothing." Victoria gasped, clutching her pearls. "And option B?" "Option B," Morgan said. "You retire. Today. You sign over all voting rights to Charlie. You vacate the penthouse, its company property after all. You move to the small cottage on the Connecticut grounds. You receive a monthly stipend of $4,000. That's roughly what Charlie and I were living on." "$4,000?" Victoria shrieked. "That won't even cover my hair appointments." "Then learn to do your own hair," Charlie said coldly. "Morgan learned to live on ramen noodles while pregnant because you cut us off. You can learn to budget." "This is insane," Rowan spat. "We are your parents." "No," Charlie corrected. "You are my biological predecessors. Parents don't let their grandchild nearly die to teach a lesson." Charlie checked his watch. "You have 5 minutes to decide. After that, Arthur Sterling, our lawyer, is filing the foreclosure papers." Rowan looked at Victoria. He looked at the luxury office that defined his existence. Then he looked at the sheer financial power standing in front of him. He realized with a sinking horror that Morgan wasn't bluffing. She had the Blackwood ruthlessness in her blood. "Where is the pen?" Rowan whispered. The transition of power wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was an eviction, and it was brutal. By the time the ink was dry on the acquisition papers, the locksmiths were already drilling into the mahogany doors of the Fifth Avenue penthouse. These weren't the polite, white-gloved movers Victoria Whitmore was accustomed to commanding. These were foreclosure agents, men in thick boots and reflective vests, who handled priceless heirlooms with the indifference of garbage collectors. Victoria stood in the center of the foyer, the marble floor cold beneath her feet. She was watching her life being dismantled item by item. "Careful with that," she snapped, her voice shrill, as a worker wrapped a Ming Dynasty vase in brown packing paper. "That vase has been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations." The worker didn't even look up. He slapped a neon orange sticker onto the side of the porcelain. "Inventory tag 409-B. Property of Whitmore Global Corporate Art Reserve. It stays with the company, ma'am." "It stays..." Victoria gasped, clutching her chest. But it matches the drapes." "The drapes stay too," the man said flatly. Victoria looked around wildly. Everything was being tagged. The grand piano, the silver service, the Persian rugs. She realized with a sick, sinking feeling that she hadn't actually owned anything. The company owned it all. And now the company belonged to the girl she had called a nobody. 10 minutes later, She was standing on the curb of Fifth Avenue. It was raining a cold, stinging drizzle that matted her usually perfect blowout against her skull. 2 suitcases sat in the puddles at her feet. Rowan was standing next to her, looking like a man who had been hollowed out. He was fumbling with his smartphone, cursing under his breath as rain droplets hit the screen. I don't know how to work this app," he muttered, trying to summon an Uber. For 40 years, a black town car had been waiting for him every time he stepped outside. Now the curb was empty. They were exiled to the caretaker's cottage on the family's old estate in Connecticut. In previous years, they had housed their gardeners there. Now it was their entire world. It was a perfectly adequate house, 3 bedrooms, a small garden. But to Victoria, it was a prison cell. The silence was the loudest part. The phone, which used to ring incessantly with invitations to galas, charity auctions, and board meetings, was dead. Their friends, the senators, the CEOs, the socialites, had evaporated the moment the news broke. It was a social quarantine. Months dragged by in a grey haze. Rowan spent his days in a recliner, drinking cheap scotch and watching business news, torturing himself by watching Whitmore stock prices soar under Charlie's leadership. Victoria spent her time wandering the small rooms, dusting surfaces that no maid would ever clean again. Then came the magazine. It was a Tuesday in late autumn. Victoria was at the mailbox at the end of the driveway when she saw the cover of People magazine sticking out of the bundle. The headline screamed in bold yellow letters, "The $1 billion baby." Her hands shook as she pulled it out. There was a photo taken by a long lens camera of Charlie and Morgan leaving Mount Sinai Hospital. They looked exhausted, disheveled but radiant with a joy that Victoria couldn't comprehend. In Morgan's arms was a bundle wrapped in a white blanket. Luke Silas Whitmore. Victoria stared at the grainy image of the baby's face. He had Charlie's eyes. He had the Whitmore chin. He was perfect. Something broke inside her. It wasn't regret exactly. Victoria was too proud for regret. But it was a fierce, possessive panic. That baby was her legacy. That baby was the future of the bloodline. They couldn't just cut her out. She was the matriarch. "We have to see him," Victoria said, storming back into the cottage, the magazine clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Victoria, don't," Rowan mumbled from his chair. "The lawyers said—" "I don't care what the lawyers said," she shrieked. "I am his grandmother. Blood is thicker than contracts, Rowan. Once Charlie sees me, once he sees his mother holding his son, he'll melt. He was always a soft boy. He just needs to be reminded of who raised him." She forced Rowan to put on his one remaining suit. They drove the 2 hours into the city in their rusted sedan, the heater rattling the entire way. They went straight to the West Village. Morgan and Charlie had bought a brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was an imposing building, warm light spilling from the windows, contrasting with the gloomy twilight. Victoria walked up the steps and pressed the buzzer. She smoothed her coat, practiced her smile. She prepared the tears. Buzz. Buzz. The intercom crackled to life. It wasn't Charlie's voice. It was a deep, gravelly voice of a security guard. "State your business." "This is Victoria Whitmore," she announced, lifting her chin. "I am here to see my son, Charlie, and my grandson." There was a long, heavy pause. The static hissed. "One moment." Victoria turned to Rowan, a triumphant smile on her face. "See, they're buzzing us in." But the heavy oak door didn't open. Instead, a side service door clicked open and a man stepped out onto the stoop. It wasn't Charlie. It was Arthur Sterling, the family's new head of legal counsel, a shark in a bespoke suit. He held a black tablet in his hand, his face unreadable. "Mrs. Whitmore," Arthur said, his voice clipped and cold, "you are in violation of the harassment protocol." "Harassment?" Victoria laughed, a brittle sound. "I am visiting my family. You can't stop a grandmother from seeing her grandson. It's unnatural." "Actually, I can," Arthur said. He stepped down one stair, bringing him eye level with her. "And the state of New York agrees with me." He tapped the screen of the tablet and turned it around so she could see. It was a digital audio file. "Do you recognize this recording, Mrs. Whitmore? It's dated January the 12th, 9:42 p.m. Victoria frowned. "I don't know what you're talking about." Arthur pressed play. The sound that came from the tablet was crystal clear. It cut through the street noise like a knife. First, the sound of Charlie, sobbing, breathless and terrified. "Mom, please, Morgan is in the hospital. It's bad. The baby is in trouble. We have no insurance. I just need $5,000. Save her. Save the baby." Victoria froze. Her stomach dropped. Then her own voice filled the air. Cold. Sharp. Dismissive. "You made your bed, Charlie. If she loses the baby, perhaps it's for the best. It gives you a clean slate to come home." Click. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than the grave. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. She felt like she might vomit on the sidewalk. You recorded that?" she whispered. "All calls to the estate are logged for security," Arthur said, tucking the tablet under his arm. "We subpoenaed the logs. We played this recording for a family court judge this morning, Mrs. Whitmore. The judge was horrified." Arthur took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "The judge granted an emergency permanent order of protection. He cited extreme emotional cruelty and a credible threat to the child's well-being. He stated that a woman who actively wishes for a child's death does not earn the privilege of holding that child when he survives." Victoria staggered back, her heel catching on the pavement. She reached out for the railing to steady herself. "Charlie," she choked out. Does Charlie know you're doing this?" "Charlie gave me the recording," Arthur said simply. The words hit her like a physical blow. "He asked me to give you a message," Arthur continued. "What?" She wept, the tears finally real. "Tell me, please." Arthur looked at her with zero sympathy. He said, "Tell her that Luke will know exactly who she is. When he is old enough, we will tell him the story. We won't hide it. We will tell him that his grandmother had a choice between her pride and his life, and she chose her pride." Arthur turned on his heel. He walked back to the service door. "Goodbye, Mrs. Whitmore. If you return to this property, you will be arrested." The door slammed shut. The deadbolt slid home with a final thud. Victoria stood alone on the sidewalk. She looked up at the third-floor window. The curtains were drawn, but the light inside was golden and warm. Through the fabric, she could see the silhouette of a man rocking a baby back and forth. She saw the silhouette of a woman come up behind him, resting her head on his shoulder. It was a tableau of perfect domestic peace. A family. And she was on the outside, in the cold, exactly where she had tried to put them. "They didn't let us in," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I told you," Rowan said from the sidewalk, his voice tired and defeated. "Let's go, Victoria. We're wasting gas." As they drove away back toward the darkness of the countryside, Victoria stared out the window. They passed a massive digital billboard in Times Square. It was an advertisement for the new Whitmore Blackwood Charity Gala. The tagline, written in elegant script, read, "Family first, always." The irony tasted like ash in her mouth. She closed her eyes, but she could still hear the recording playing in her mind on a loop. If she loses the baby, perhaps it's for the best. Back in the warm nursery, Charlie looked down at baby Luke. The infant was sleeping soundly, gripping Charlie's pinky finger with a tiny, incredibly strong hand. "She came," Morgan asked softly, walking in with a warm bottle. "Yeah," Charlie said. He didn't look out the window. He didn't look at the street. His eyes were fixed on his son. Arthur handled it. "Do you feel bad?" Morgan asked, touching Charlie's arm gently. "They are your parents, Charlie." Charlie remembered the fear in the construction site. He remembered the hunger in the freezing apartment. He remembered the dial tone that night. "No," Charlie said, kissing Luke's forehead. "I don't feel bad. I feel safe." 5 years is a lifetime in the world of high finance. It is enough time for empires to crumble and for new gods to ascend. In the half-decade since the heavy oak doors of the West Village brownstone had been slammed shut in Victoria Whitmore's face, the landscape of New York power had shifted beneath her feet. The Whitmore-Blackwood alliance had not just survived, it had thrived with a ferocity that baffled Wall Street analysts. Morgan, with her grandfather's steel in her spine, had revolutionized the logistics of the company, cutting waste and maximizing efficiency. Charlie, conversely, had become the soul of the operation. He implemented profit sharing for factory workers, paid paternity leave, and scholarship funds. The Wall Street Journal had dubbed it the industrial miracle of the decade. They weren't just billionaires. They were untouchable. Or so they thought. Peace at the summit is always an illusion. The higher you climb, the thinner the air, and the sharper the knives waiting in the dark. The attack came on a grey Tuesday in November. It wasn't a physical assault, but in their world, it was far more lethal, a hostile corporate decapitation. The Kensington Group, led by the father of Beatrice, the woman Charlie had refused to marry years ago, launched a surprise bid to swallow Whitmore global whole. Lord Kensington had smelled blood. He assumed that Charlie's focus on charity made him soft and that Morgan was too distracted by motherhood to notice the sharks circling the boat. The showdown took place in the main boardroom of the new headquarters at One World Trade Center. The room was a fortress of glass and chrome overlooking the city that Charlie now effectively helped run. Lord Kensington sat at the head of the table, looking like a vulture in a three-piece suit. He was flanked by a phalanx of aggressive lawyers. When Charlie and Morgan entered, Kensington didn't even stand up. "It's a generous offer, Charlie," Kensington said, his voice dripping with condescension as he slid a thick contract across the polished glass table. "We are offering 20% above market value for your controlling shares. Take the money. Go play house with your wife and son. Let the adults handle the heavy lifting of industry." Charlie picked up the heavy document. He didn't open it. He weighed it in his hand, looking at Kensington with an expression that wasn't anger. It was boredom. "You're miscalculating," Charlie said softly, tossing the contract back. It landed with a heavy thud. "You think because I used to mix concrete in New Jersey to survive, and because my wife used to pour coffee to pay tuition, that we don't know how to hunt. You mistake kindness for weakness, Lord Kensington. That is a fatal error." Kensington chuckled, lighting a cigar despite the building's regulations. "Spare me the morality play. I have the capital. I have the board's ear. You're done." Morgan stepped forward. She was wearing a simple white suit, sharp and immaculate. She carried no files, no briefcase. Just a single, small, black USB drive. She placed it gently on the glass table. The click echoed in the silent room. "Lord Kensington," Morgan said, her voice silky and dangerous. "Before you initiate a proxy war, you might want to review the contents of that drive. Folder 3 specifically." Kensington frowned the cigar, pausing halfway to his mouth. "What is this bribe?" "It's an insurance policy," Morgan replied, leaning her hands on the table and staring him down. "It contains the unredacted environmental impact reports from your lithium mines in Nevada. The reports you paid $2 million to bury in 2019. The ones that prove you have been knowingly leaking arsenic into the local groundwater for 3 years to save on filtration costs." The color drained from Kensington's face so fast he looked like a corpse. That is privileged internal data. That is impossible to obtain." "It was privileged," Charlie interjected, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "until you decided to threaten my family. Now it's leverage." Morgan tapped the drive with a manicured fingernail. "If you do not withdraw your bid and resign from your own chairmanship by noon today, a copy of this drive goes to the EPA. Another copy goes to the New York Times, and the third goes to the Department of Justice." Kensington looked at his lawyers. They looked away, terrified. He looked at Charlie, expecting to see the soft boy he had heard rumors about. Instead, he saw the eyes of Silas Blackwood staring back at him. "Get out of my building," Charlie said. Kensington stood up, his hands shaking, and left without a word. The takeover was dead in 3 minutes. That night, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. They were celebrating Luke's 5th birthday at their private estate in the Hudson Valley. There were no press helicopters, no security details in sight, just the hum of crickets and the smell of charcoal. It was a backyard barbecue, no Michelin star chefs, just Charlie in an apron flipping burgers. Silas Blackwood, 92 years old, and confined to a wheelchair, sat in the shade of an oak tree. He watched his great-grandson Luke chasing a golden retriever across the sprawling green lawn. "He runs fast," Silas grunted, watching the boy tumble and laugh. "He does," Charlie smiled, handing the old man a glass of iced tea. "He gets that from Morgan. She never stops running until she gets what she wants." Silas took a sip, his sharp eyes assessing Charlie. "You did good today, boy. I heard about Kensington. I was worried about you at first. I thought you might be too much like your father, all bark, no bite. But you have a spine. You protected what was yours." "I had to learn the hard way," Charlie replied, looking toward the house where Morgan was laughing with friends. Miles away in a small, damp cottage in Connecticut, the hard way was the only reality Rowan and Victoria Whitmore knew. Their exile had settled into a grey, suffocating misery. The cottage was adequate, but to them it was a prison cell. The faucets leaked. The heating was spotty. But the poverty wasn't the worst part. It was the silence. Every Christmas, Victoria would write a long, pleading letter. She would put it in an envelope with a card, and every January it would return to her mailbox marked "Refused Return to Sender." One afternoon, Victoria was at the local budget market. She hated this store. The fluorescent lights buzzed and the floor was sticky. She stood in the checkout line, clutching a handful of coupons she had spent the morning, clipping a humiliation that still made her hands tremble. She looked up, and her heart stopped. Mounted above the register was a small television tuned to a national news channel. The banner at the bottom read, "Man of the Year, Charlie Whitmore." There he was, her son. He looked older, distinguished with silver touching his temples. He was holding Luke, her grandson, in his arms. Morgan stood beside them, cutting the ribbon on a new pediatric cancer wing they had fully funded. They looked like royalty. Not the cold, stiff royalty of the Whitmore dynasty, but something warmer, something real. The reporter on the screen held a microphone to Charlie. "Mr. Whitmore, you've donated half your annual salary this year to single mothers and families in crisis. Why is that cause so personal to you? You come from such privilege." Victoria held her breath. The cashier was beeping her items, but she couldn't hear it. On the screen, Charlie looked directly into the camera lens. For a fleeting, agonizing second, Victoria felt as though he was looking right at her, standing there in her worn-out coat. "I don't come from privilege," Charlie said, his voice steady. "I know what it's like to have nothing. I know what it's like to be cold. And I know that family isn't about whose blood is in your veins. It's about who stands beside you when the world turns its back on you." He pulled Luke closer, kissing the boy's head. "I want my son to know that kindness is the only currency that actually matters. Money can be lost, titles can be stripped, but how you treat people, that is your legacy." Victoria stared at the screen. She saw the way Luke hugged his father, a fierce, trusting grip. She realized she didn't know the sound of her grandson's voice. She didn't know his favorite color. She didn't know if he liked dinosaurs or cars. She was a stranger to her own immortality. "Ma'am," the cashier snapped, "are you going to pay?" Victoria looked down at her coupons. They looked like trash in her hands. She left the cart full of groceries in the middle of the aisle and walked out to her rusted sedan, weeping uncontrollably in the parking lot. Back at the Hudson Valley estate, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds. Morgan found Charlie on the back porch. The party was winding down. He was leaning against the railing, watching Luke catch fireflies in a jar, his laughter ringing out like a bell in the crisp air. "You okay?" Morgan asked softly, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. "Yeah." Charlie exhaled, the tension of the years finally unspooling from his shoulders. "I was just thinking about that dinner, the night they threw the prenup at you, the night I walked out. Do you regret it?" Morgan asked, her voice gentle. "You lost your parents, Charlie. You lost your birthright. That is a heavy price to pay." Charlie turned in her arms. He looked at the sprawling house that was filled with love, not just expensive furniture. He looked at his wife, who had saved him when he was drowning. He looked at his son, who was safe, happy, and kind. "I didn't lose my parents, Morgan," Charlie whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I lost two people who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing." He kissed her forehead, pulling her close as the first stars began to prick the darkness above them. "I lost an inheritance," Charlie said, a smile finally reaching his eyes. "But I won the lottery." And as Luke ran into his father's arms, shouting about the light of the fireflies, the headlines, the billions, and the drama faded into the background. All that was left was the only thing that was real: a family. This story reminds us of a brutal, often unspoken truth. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. Charlie and Morgan proved that true family isn't defined by DNA, last names, or bank accounts. It is defined by loyalty, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand together when the freezing winds of life try to blow you apart. Victoria and Rowan Whitmore ended up with exactly what they valued most: their pride. But they died alone, realizing too late that their pride couldn't hug them back. What would you have done if you were in Charlie's shoes? Would you have eventually forgiven your parents for the sake of your child? Or would you have cut them off forever to protect your peace, just like he did? It's a complicated question with no easy answer. Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice, karma, and redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.